So I would like to also welcome Gregory Peterson, one of the Jackson Center's co-founders, to the stage now as well for a brief interview of our award recipient this evening before we move into the rest of our program. So gentlemen, if you would take your seat.
I am so thrilled we're back. I'm so thrilled he got that box, because we're going to use that box. Now, I got the award, that's all nice and wonderful. You got to know that Hans and I are both Swedish. I'm Swedish. And I belong to a club here in the area called the Norden Club. And we held our 100th anniversary, and King Carl Gustaf came here to our event. And we gave to him a very special Norden Club presentation because he is the most honored Swedish person and a member of the Norden Club. The second most honored person from Sweden is Hans Corell. Hans Corell. So at the time we gave the king, the only thing we could, and they really appreciated, was a special bottle of Swedish drink, and we gave him one. We made two. Here's the second. So this is a Norden Club bottle of glue. And
oi. Ay. Thank you so much.
I can feel it.
Oi. Glug. Yes. Well, this I must tell the king when I meet the next time. Yes.
There are now two of them, and I'll give that to you, and that can fit nicely into that box.
I see. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a seat.
Thank you.
We're so glad that we're able to get together. In 2007 was our first one ever. And David Crane and I had an opportunity. David knows all you folks. I didn't know any of you. But we had the first event. And the most important thing on Monday night, the Monday night of that event, which we'll have Monday, this upcoming, was we were called to dinner. For those who were here at the first one, we were called to dinner by a special instrument played by Don Ferencz, and it was bagpipes. Now, Don's not here, but we have bagpipes, so I understand you're pretty good at that. Are you ready to take the challenge?
Well, I don't know. You said you would subject me to a surprise, but may I surprise you then, that I actually gave Kofi Annan, when I left the UN, a gift, namely a hymn composed by the great Highland Pipe. And the title of this hymn is Secretary General Kofi Annan's Prayer for Peace. And he used that one also in Kenya when he tried to get the parties to be there. So may I try?
Sure.
Surprise?
Yeah.
Can you hear it? Just a few bars. Secretary General Kofi Annan's Prayer for Peace. And the inspiration was our conversation the evening before he would meet with Saddam Hussein to negotiate the inspection of his palaces back in 1998. And the evening before we sat there and we had drafted an agreement text, and all of a sudden he said, I asked him, is there something else we should do? Is there something I have forgotten? And he fell silent, and then all of a sudden he said quietly, and you know, it often helps to pray. And that gave me the inspiration to compose this hymn, Secretary General Kofi Annan's Prayer for Peace.
Wow, congratulations. I had no idea. That was not a setup.
No, stop it there. Okay.
So there it is.
I had no idea, but I thought I'd better load this one in because you never know what surprises Greg comes up with.
Well, the bagpipes will be there, so you can play them. You know, one of the nice things right here is a bunch of the prosecutors. You know, we've got Fatou Bensouda, we got Nizat, we've got Jim Johnson, we got Matthias, we got Robert Porti, we got Stephen Rapp is coming. These are all prosecutors of tribunals of which you were a part as legal counsel, and not only behind the curtain, sort of like the Oz, but at the same time, you know, with a delegate to the Rome Treaty. Do you pause and say, wow, look what I fathered here?
No, I have a very humble opinion here. I mean, I had no idea that I would end up at the international level when I started my studies. But as I said, it's so much coincidence. And when I was asked to become a war crimes rapporteur in the former Yugoslavia, I accepted that immediately. And then with my colleagues Helmut Türk from Austria and Gro Hillestad Thune of Norway, we elaborated the first draft of a statute for the Yugoslav Tribunal. But this was the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And that organization did not have the authority that the UN Security Council had. So when we presented our report, a full-fledged statute for an international criminal court in February, I think 13th of February 2003, it was immediately sent to the United Nations, where they had started working on this also in the Security Council, and Sheriff Bassioni, who everybody knows here, he was involved in that. So the Security Council took over, and late February the same year, they decided to establish the Yugoslav Tribunal. But then, of course, when I came as legal counsel to the United Nations in March 2004, I was involved in the establishment of the tribunal. And when the Security Council decided to establish the Rwanda Tribunal in November 1994, I was sent to Rwanda to convince the President, Prime Minister and Vice President that they should cooperate with this court. So this is how it began. But then came, of course, the others, Sierra Leone and Cambodia, very important.
Well, you know, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, UN created tribunals. Sierra Leone was a special court that required a little bit of a different approach by the General Counsel. How did you kind of manufacture that?
Absolutely. Sierra Leone wanted to have a tribunal also of the kind that they had in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. But the Security Council was not prepared to establish yet another tribunal of this size. So instead, they asked the Secretary General to organize an agreement between the United Nations and Sierra Leone. And I was, of course, as legal counsel, charged with negotiating this agreement. And I must say, I had a very positive experience with negotiating this agreement with then Justice Minister Solomon Bereva of Sierra Leone. And to make a long story short, we came to an agreement which we signed on the 16th of January 2002. And then the court started coming into form. And one of the first important decisions was who should be appointed prosecutor. And here I got information about David Crane. So I was instructed to contact David Crane and inform him that there was ideas about that he should be appointed prosecutor. And to make a long story short, this was a very, very important decision and a very useful and lucky decision, because this court developed into a very, very important instrument, and we will discuss this in the coming days here.
So David Crane's not here.
No.
We can talk about it. So what was it that somebody suggested out of the blue, somebody who was in the military, David Crane of all people, that he would be nominated to be the first chief prosecutor? Do you know?
Well, I mean, in the UN, there are nominations coming from different corners,
Yeah.
and you look at them and discuss them with the Secretary General. And the result here was that the nomination of David Crane that was the person we should approach. And it was my opportunity, it was my task to do this. And we had a very positive conversation, the first contact. And then, as you know, he took up this position and managed to, shall we say, conduct the important work of the prosecutor in a manner that made a great success of this court. And not least that this court demonstrated that an agreement between the United Nations and a member state establishing an international criminal court gives this court an international standing, and it was possible to prosecute a head of state, indict a head of state, and then to have a judgment against a former head of state, Charles Taylor, who was sentenced to a long sentence in prison for the very serious crimes that the court found that he had committed. But I think that the manner in which David organized the work of the prosecutor's office was extremely important. And this is why I think it's so fine to come here to Jakarta when the prosecutors come here to discuss questions of common interest and how one should continue into the future here. And of course, the importance of the professionalism and the integrity of the prosecutor is absolutely necessary to establish an international order under the rule of law.
There's a segue here, and we know there's a special court for crimes of aggression that is being floated out there as a concept. Is that Sierra Leone tribunal model? Is that one to which could be replicated or in some form or fashion, and anything we look forward to?
Yes, I mean, there are several initiatives here, but David Crane and I and Irving Cotter and others have worked on the idea, why not use the experience of the practitioners here, who actually established a court very quickly with the support of the requesting country. We managed to negotiate an agreement in a very short time, and the wish of the country was to have a proper court with international, completely independent judges. And I was very positively, not surprised, but positively, shall we say, impressed by the manner in which Sierra Leone wanted to establish a court. And I mentioned Solomon Bareva, and we had an excellent communication in the negotiations. And as a matter of fact, the majority of the judges of the court should be international, but there should also be some national judges. But I remember that when the Sierra Leone presented their first list of national judges, among them was an international judge.
Really?
From another Commonwealth country.
Now, Sierra Leone, potential model for what could be a Ukrainian tribunal, but at the same time you had one other tribunal you were part of too, which was a little more difficult, the Cambodia tribunal. I know Robert is here.
Yes.
And I know that didn't go as well. And just curious about the real politics. At some point you actually walked away from the negotiations.
That is correct. I mean, Cambodia wanted also to have a tribunal. And I then had the model from Sierra Leone. So this was what I thought was the appropriate way of responding to the request from Cambodia. But Cambodians were not interested. They wanted a completely different court with a majority of Cambodian judges and so forth. So at the end of the day, when I had signed the agreement with Solomon Bareva in February 2002, Kofi Annan decided to withdraw from the negotiations with Cambodia. We said we didn't rely on being able to establish a proper international independent and impartial court. But this caused a lot of concern among member states. And to make a long story short, in December 2002, they ordered us to continue the negotiations with Cambodia and to accept the conditions that Cambodia had made in the negotiations. And so we had to do this. But I was not happy with the result when I signed the agreement. At the same time, I understood that the international functionaries here, prosecutors, judges, and so forth, they would do as much as they could to make this court operate properly. And I think it's admirable how they have performed their duties there. But at the same time, I think that even if this court has had some very positive, shall we say, contributions to the situation in Cambodia and the manner in which the general public have been able to follow the trials, I think that the Cambodia solution, that type of tribunal, should not be a model for coming efforts of this nature. Rather, one should use the Sierra Leone as the model. But the interesting thing is that with Cambodia, they turned to the General Assembly, not to the Security Council. So if Ukraine would turn to the Security Council now, then it would be vetoed by Russia. But if they turn to the General Assembly, they may agree and ask the Secretary General to have a negotiated agreement with Ukraine. And I remember that when the very important General Assembly resolution on Ukraine was taken by the General Assembly on the 2nd of March this year, I think 141 states voted in favor of this. Maybe not so many will be voting in favor of this agreement, but I'm sure that we would have the sufficient majority, because after all, can we accept that the suspect is the head of state of a member, a permanent member of the UN Security Council? Again, I come back to what I said when thanking for the prize. We should honor the heritage that we got from a generation that had experienced 2 world wars.
Speaking of that heritage, we're at the Robert Jackson Center. I am curious whether in your career, whether studying at law or in your application, Robert Jackson became part of your thinking process.
Well, I mean, certainly I read the history and so forth, and gradually you understood more and more of the situation. And in particular, since my family suffered, my grandfather on my mother's side I never met. He lost his life to a German torpedo in the North Sea in 1918, just before the war was over. So I grew up with the understanding, the knowledge of the First World War, the Second World War, and the importance of creating peace in the world. And this is why the UN Charter was negotiated to, as it says, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And therefore, I studied more and more, and when all of a sudden I was involved in the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunals, I certainly looked at the heritage of Robert Jackson and read some of what he said before the court, which I think was very, very important. And I think this is historical, that it was possible to create this tribunal and also to give birth to the Nuremberg principles, and which is a heritage that we now have incorporated in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court.
Did you get all this, Ed? This is great.
Sorry?
I just want to make sure the camera guy got all this. This is great. Thank you for saying that. You know, you mentioned earlier one of your heroes, Dag Hammarskjöld. Talk to me a little bit more about what he meant to a student, Hans Corell, and kind of his legacy.
Well, I mean, this was very important. I was a student at Uppsala University when the message about his death came. And of course, all festivities were cancelled, and we had to completely change the program and so forth. But we were many students who sat down to discuss and reflect over what had happened, and were we enough, shall we say, interested and directed our attention to the world, or we just look at ourselves as students at the university. And I think this gave us the idea that we have to look outward to the world. And as a matter of fact, I had to put on my tails and my student's cap and my blue and yellow ribbon, and I was a steward in the cathedral, at Uppsala Cathedral, at Dag Hammarskjöld's funeral. But I had no idea that I would end up in the UN as legal counsel, no idea whatsoever. But my father gave me his book, Vägmärken, Markings, and I read it with great interest. And of course, when I came to the UN, I read it again with even more interest. And on my webpage, I have one of his markings that made a deep impression on me, which in English I have translated it myself, because I think Auden's translation was perhaps not so sharp as the Swedish original. But this reads that openness to life gives a swift insight into the life situation of others, like a flash of lightning, a must to force the problem from its emotional sting into a clearly conceived intellectual form and act accordingly. I think it's so important. I mean, you can, and as a judge, you can get upset about what happened, and then of course, all of a sudden the case is before you. Then you have to be very precise, and your integrity is there. And also, I was impressed by Dag Hammarskjöld's very important address that he gave at Oxford, I think, in May 1961. Yes, where he is addressing the integrity of the international civil servant. And I read that with great interest. Also, when he made a parallel to the importance of integrity and the importance that you make your assessment if you have a complex problem, and then you have to make a decision based on facts and the law. And he then says, is this not different from what every judge has to do? So I recognized myself immediately when I read that, so I've quoted it many times.
As we draw towards the end of this interview, and this has been a thrill for me, what's your sense as you look down the road 10 years from now on the kind of the state of international criminal law? It sort of ebbed and flowed a little bit. What do you see as where we might be 10 years from now?
Well, I must say that I'm disappointed at the development over the last few years. And we have the World Justice Project, which was developed here in the US and which is now organized, and headquarters is now in Seattle, outside Seattle, Colorado, in Washington, state of Washington. And they have a very important rule of law index, which they issue every year. I think the next issue comes in November. And it's Betsy Anderson, who is the executive director of the World Justice Project. I think it's so important that this analysis is made, and that politicians are made aware of that they have a responsibility to see to this for the future. And I will not, shall we say, miss the opportunity of drawing attention to a guide for politicians on the rule of law. The person who gave me the idea to this guide was Helmut Schmidt, former Chancellor of Germany. And I was invited to advise an association of former heads of states and government, Interaction Council of former heads of states and government. And when I started talking about the rule of law, Helmut Schmidt all of a sudden asked the rhetorical question, I wonder if politicians understand their responsibility for the rule of law. And I thought there are books written about this, but they are busy, and you have to understand they can't read too many thick books, and which books should they read? If we could elaborate a short guide for politicians on the rule of law. So I asked the Royal Wallenberg Institute in Sweden and a sister institute in the Netherlands that was mentioned here by Kristen, to develop a draft of a guide for politicians, not more than 40, 50 pages. To make a long story short, this guide was published in 2012, and it is now translated into 26 languages. And it doesn't cost anything. It's some 40, 50 pages, and you can print it from the web. Just Google rule of law, a guide for politicians, and you will receive it. And then to come back to your question here, it is absolutely necessary that people who appear in government's situation understand that we have to join hands on the globe. I don't see any substitute for the sovereign national state, because this is where you have to regulate the situation for the ordinary citizens. You can't have the bus fees in Chautauqua decided by the General Assembly of the UN. You have to have decision-making as close as the citizens around the world as you can. But there has to be this overriding international umbrella, as I would say, of international law, where we find also now international criminal law. And this means that you also must be able to try suspected heads of state if they are suspected of having committed crimes. So my hope is that the understanding will grow, and also that the younger generation, who has understood more about the climate than our generation, will understand the importance of the rule of law for the future. And I think that the duty we have as more elderly is to try to convey the message to coming generations that you must do better than we did in our generation, that you have to look to the future. And if you look at the population of the world, there were 2 billion people on the globe when the UN was founded in 1945. We are almost 8 billion people now. How much can this globe take? And we see that glaciers are melting. And I was involved with the oceans, responsibility for the ocean and affairs in the UN. 70% of the globe is ocean. And I mean, it's an enormous area. And then you have the glaciers, both in the north and in particular in Antarctica. If that starts melting, it would be a very serious situation. We have a wonderful planet to live on, but we should respect this planet, and we should treat it as we can, best as we can, for coming generations. That would be my advice. And also, we must never forget that the rule of law is necessary for international peace and security. And one of the most important elements in the rule of law is criminal justice.
As the ambassador said, joining hands is important. Let's join hands in thanking Ambassador Hans Corell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, this guy.
We're going now.